Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second episode of the Rambling History Podcast. I am Zach. I'm joined here by my co-host, Joseph.
Good day.
And today we're going to be rambling about the Huns.
Well, the Huns, as probably you've already heard from general popular culture, was a nomadic steppe tribe that generally covered the area from the Danube River to China. They were one of the first large tribes that managed to make a big impact on the Roman Empire. Of course, the first one was the Scythians, but they essentially fell in the end to the Sasanians. The tribe was generally first identified by the Eastern Roman Empire on the border of the Danube River, which was around Dacia, which they had already reached by pushing out multiple tribes, including the Goths, the Vandals, the Herulians, I can keep on listing it, but that's pretty useless. Basically, they pushed out every single tribe around them, near them, next to them, inside of them, because nobody wanted to be near them, which we will get into later as to why.
Yeah, they either conquered everyone and absorbed them into them, like they did with the Alans, or they killed them until they ran away, like they did with the Goths.
Yeah. So generally the Huns, before their main identification around 200-300 AD, they were described by certain Egyptian philosophers and writers like Ptolemy as tribes that lived around the western region of the steppes and Eurasia, so Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, the Stans. And they lived between multiple tribes, including the Bastani and Roxolani, which were tribes that were roughly in the Dacia region, although that was, at this time, they would be not yet have been migrating to that region, so they would have been more in the Black Sea region.
The Pontic steppes.
Yeah, the Pontic steppes, basically north of Crimea. After this long period of, I'd say, a couple of 400 years since their first description in Egyptian literature, they were identified by Eastern Roman diplomats who were at the time influencing tribes that neighbored them north of the Danube River it was basically a Roman tactic at the time was to bribe certain tribes to make them more powerful than the others, to ensure that the balance of power was established, so that they could basically bribe only 3 tribes and have them control all of the other ones. This tactic lasted for a decent while, which was why the Roman Empire was able to maintain the status quo even during its decline for a long while.
They basically did this everywhere.
In Germany, the Britons
did the same tactic when they were conquering Gaul under Caesar. They did it when they were conquering modern-day Turkey. With all of the assorted minor states that were located there. They did it in the Balkans. It was basically their go-to tactic anytime there were a bunch of barbarian tribes they had to deal with.
Yeah, they always made a couple powerful, had them basically do all the work, and then finished up by gobbling them up. Or in this case, they were already rather overextended, as this is in the rough 350 AD era. So they mainly just created them to maintain the status quo, let them collapse, rose up other tribes to take that role, and it was basically a cycle in the hope to maintain itself. This, of course, changed with the coming of the Huns, roughly identified around 395 to be for the first offensive against the East Roman Empire. The main purpose of these attacks were for the Huns to establish tributary states, as they had done before this with the various tribes that were surrounding them. They basically attacked, razed a couple of cities, slaughtered a couple thousands of people, or hundreds depending on the size of the tribe, and then the 5 or so that were left were forced to pay the Huns for protection, or they too were killed. This tactic was then attempted to be implemented against the Eastern Roman Empire too, through a siege on Constantinople and a general invasion of the Thracian heartland, which would be today the Bulgaria and the Balkans. A lot of devastation was obviously committed, but in the end the city managed to stand. It did not fall to the Huns. But this was only because the emperor at the time, being the Emperor Theodosius, one of the many Theodosius, but this was one of the first ones, he basically accepted the offer of the Huns and he became a tributary state. This was the first time that showed that the Huns were, even though they were not united, not identified, they were not a state, they were not an empire, they were just a couple of warriors that liked killing people, and they managed to subdue one of the greatest empires of the time.
That being the eastern half of the Roman Empire.
Yes, the eastern half being the area that covered Greece, Turkey, the Balkans, Syria and Egypt, and at the time it was the more stable part of the two, as it had managed, well, by virtue of not bordering Germany basically, because it managed to avoid most of the tribal migrations that happened there.
Instead,
Only
they got
really
to play with the Sassanid Empire in Persia.
Yeah, but that was an established empire, which at least was... You could at least negotiate with them. You can't negotiate with the Germanics. You have to kill them.
And it is also worth noting that the Eastern Empire controlled several much more profitable regions as opposed to the Western Roman Empire.
That is very correct. At the time, the Eastern Roman Empire controlled the general region that was considered the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, as you can call it, which basically was the Nile River, which was mostly Egypt, of course. You had the Euphrates River, of which part did cross into the Eastern Roman Empire, which had Syria and parts of Iraq, with a lot of fertile cities there,
and
including
they also
Antioch.
Controlled Pontus and the Pontic coast along the Black Sea.
But alright, so after the initial defeat, there was a time where the Huns were basically allowed to do as they wanted. They managed to invade the Sassanid Empire. They met success. They approached Ctesiphon, which was the capital of the Sasanian Empire. The city laid in the south of Iran, roughly. So they traveled all the way from the north of Kazakhstan to south of Iran, which does show that they met great success. However, they were beaten by a Persian counterattack, which led to them having to retreat. One thing that should be noted, though, tactics-wise, or at least strategy-wise, is that at the time, the Romans and the Sasanians had very different tactics. The Romans still relied on mainly heavy infantry formations. They couldn't stop the Huns from just encircling them, which led to great defeats. The Sasanians, though, also relied on heavy cavalry because of their roots in the Scythian Empire before them.
As well as having absorbed the Persians.
Yes. Well, they are the Persians.
Well, they're the Parthians.
Yes, but at this time I'd say they'd been... The culture had assimilated.
Were basically the same. They went from being one cavalry-focused steppe culture to absorbing a cavalry-focused Middle Eastern desert culture.
That is correct. But the main point being that these cultures both focused on cavalry, which meant that the Sasanians did have a better time counterattacking the Huns, which allowed them to eventually beat them back and drive them towards the Caucasus Mountains, where they obviously had to retreat because of the very bad terrain for cavalry warfare.
And it's worth noting that the span of time between them withdrawing from Thrace and the Eastern Roman Empire to withdrawing from the Sassanid Empire is like 5 years.
And this was before they even became a united empire or anything approaching a strong empire, so to say. They were still considered just some steppe nomads. Just some nomads that just were running around doing nothing but pillaging and threatening people. During this period, of course, the Huns did not just focus on the Sassanid Empire. They were not united. A lot of the various tribes of the Huns instead went north and slightly into the Germanic region. There they threatened, scared off a lot of the Germanic tribes, which would go, I'd say that would be a bit of a surprise considering that they were not exactly known for running away.
which is more or less what brought the Western Roman Empire to its knees.
Yes, by driving away.
Mass migrations of Germanic tribes such as the Franks, and as well as the aforementioned Goths and Vandals and other steppe cultures, all of which, in the same span of time, trying to migrate into Western Roman territory.
Yeah, and these tribes were not exactly used to urbanized lifestyle, which obviously led to the fact that they needed more space than could be provided for. See, you could fit the Roman Empire's population in the Roman Empire. You could fit it like 60 times. You could fill it up a lot because these empires were civilized. They were civilized. They had cities. You could fit a lot of the population in the cities. But the tribes, they did not do that. They would have 100 people for dozens of square miles
And
just to.
the other thing is these steppe tribes relied mainly upon herds for their food supply, while the majority of the Roman Empire was a farming culture.
That
So
is correct
the
too.
steppe tribes such as the Goths had considerable problems providing sufficient amounts of food for themselves, which led to a war between the Goths and the Romans, which went very poorly for the Romans.
Yeah, leading to a rather stunning and disappointing and rather shameful defeat in a battle that they could have and they really should have won. But that did lead to the Goths attaining relative independence, or at least getting a better deal than they initially had, and being allowed to roam more freely. Of course, still as foederati troops to the Romans until later time.
And foederati were auxiliaries for the later Roman
Yes.
empires. They were mercenary troops promised land and citizenship after their term of service.
Indeed.
And it ironically was Huns in service of the foederati that ultimately defeated the Gothic forces.
Yeah, because as you previously mentioned, the Huns were not united. The Romans were able to hire Huns to fight the Goths, which again fled from the Huns. So it's just a beautiful circle of death and destruction. After this period, which lasted for a rough 15 years, so in 15 to 20 years, they basically scared off the entirety of Northern Europe and Asia into Western Europe. After this, the Huns began subsiding relatively, so there was a short period where only raids took place, and inside Roman Empire not a lot was really noticed of them. This of course did not last for a long while. In 408, which meaning roughly 20 years after the last large-scale incursion, a horde from Uldin's Huns crossed into the Danube and began ravaging the region there. But they managed to achieve great success, sieging down fortresses, using actually betrayal from the Roman soldiers. They basically bribed the Roman soldiers inside the fortresses to rise up against their allies. They began ransacking Thrace and again bought off, or at least the Romans again tried to pay tribute to the Huns. But this time they managed to succeed in a superior manner than they did last time, because the unity of the tribes was so loose, there was no real leader. You didn't think, I'm gonna follow this guy no matter what. No, instead, because the tribute from the Romans was not just paid to Uldin, which was the name of the horde, the leader of the horde, instead the tribute was given to multiple of his leaders, or his subordinates, the various tribes under him, which led to many desertions because they had already been paid off by the Romans and they saw no reason to continue fighting. This eventually led to the dying off of this incursion. And then there was another period of relative rest until 434, so 30 years after this, after Uldin's incursion. You had the brothers Attila and Bleda, the big two.
Oh yeah, the big two. Attila and Bleda came to power sometime around 430 AD. and I believe they inherited rulership from their uncle,
Yes.
who left them joint rulership of the Hunnic peoples. And basically, the first thing the two did was invade the Eastern Roman Empire and force them to sign a treaty giving the Huns trade rights and tribute from the Eastern Romans.
So for the third time, putting the Romans into a state of tributary, paying tribute to their overlords, the Huns.
And the other thing that the brothers made the Romans do was give up all of the Hunnic tribes that had been living in Roman territory, which the brothers promptly put to the sword and removed any threat from them.
Leading to at least finally achieving a form of tribal unity within the Huns. Most pretenders were killed, and contrary to the Huns before this, where they were a warlike folk, but they didn't generally have large-scale wars against each other. They mostly raided outside. Attila and Bleda forming, of course, a bit of a different style of rule. They instead first off decided to kill any dissent from the side, allowing them to strengthen themselves, and finally allow for a true invasion of the West.
And this is where we see the Huns start to shift away from being a series of interconnected tribes into what we would recognize as a nation.
Well, a nation. What do we classify a nation, anyways? Nothing can be classified a nation in this time except for the Romans and the Sassanids.
An empire, we'll say. Like they developed a unified command.
Yeah, okay. I'll agree there.
Through Attila and Belda murdering anyone that dissented from their command. But hey, you do what you gotta do, right? And
a command's a command.
A few years after the formation of that treaty, one side or the other broke it. I don't remember which at the moment, and this led to the Huns invading the Romans again.
The Romans always break their treaties because when one emperor dies and the other takes over, he always thinks he has the ultimate power. So there's no reason to pay money to some random tribesman in the north.
Also, there's a fair bit of racism involved, as the Romans tended to not like barbarians. And this attempt at defying the Huns backfired in spectacular fashion when Attila and Bleda invaded and promptly demolished everything the Romans threw against them and forced a truce to be signed. And then the Romans tried to break it again, and the Huns invaded again.
And fucking destroyed the Romans again.
And forced another peace treaty, which the Romans wisely elected to honor at this point, after repeated humiliating defeats at the hands of the brothers.
Yeah.
And then Bleda died in 445 AD.
Totally not by
may or may not have been Attila's fault. If anyone has played Age of Empires 2, they're probably familiar with that depiction of how it went down, but there is historical debate on the question of whether he was murdered by Attila or not. I am unprepared to say one way or the other.
Well, I'm personally going to take the side that, considering what we know of Attila, he probably killed his brother in cold blood.
I am unprepared to say one way or the other. Following the death of his brother, sometime around 447, Attila invaded the Eastern Roman Empire once more and started sacking the Balkans and Thrace again.
These lands by now, having this is also a very interesting example because these constant raids, presented a very large change in lifestyle for the Romans. Previously, most cities were unwalled, they were open, made money beautiful, they were set in like good positions. They were not very fortified, and most of the Roman population wasn't exactly concentrated in a small city. They were more spread out in a lot of suburbs. But the Hunnic invasions and consequent barbarian invasions presented a dilemma to the Romans. They were forced to urbanize into smaller cities that were walled off and had strong garrisons, living in the countryside, relatively depopulated compared to the past. This obviously had benefits and side effects that
It
were not as
also helped
beneficial.
with the depopulation in that there were a lot fewer people you needed to house after the Huns swept through.
Indeed, because most were sadly enough either enslaved or a bit dead.
Just a little bit dead.
Yeah, but dead enough to present a very large scale depopulation of the general European population, I'd say. I should look up the exact numbers actually, but I'd be willing to say that a good 10-20% of Europe's population was
And
decimated.
there's also an important thing to consider. This time when Attila invaded, there was why the Eastern Roman Empire was currently in the middle of famines and plagues, riots in the city of Constantinople, and a series of earthquakes going on. So it was
Yes.
not a good time to be living in the Eastern Roman Empire.
Well, it was never a good time to live in the Eastern Roman Empire before Western Rome fell.
And in the middle of all of this, the Huns continued to remain pretty much unbeaten by the Romans, and raided as far south as Thermopylae in Greece, and elected to retreat rather than get caught with the plague.
Um,
They
and now we also
then withdrew from the Eastern Roman Empire, and throughout all of this, they had maintained pretty good relations with the western half of the empire, but things got complicated sometime around 450 AD when Honoria, I believe that's how you
Honoria?
pronounce that,
Honoria, I guess.
sister of Valentinian III, sent Attila a ring and requested his help in escaping a betrothal to a Roman senator. Attila promptly claimed Honoria as his bride and demanded half of the Western Roman Empire as a dowry. This obviously was rejected by the Romans, and the Huns invaded.
Good old invasions again, and this time the East Roman Empire actually managed to not get terribly fucked.
No, this time it
That
was
it
the
was the Western
Western
Romans.
Empire that got fucked.
This, of course, by this time most of the Goths, the Franks, Burgundians, and like the Suebi tribes, they had mostly already immigrated into Gaul, which would be called France today,
Namely,
and a bit,
by fleeing the Huns.
yeah, the other
It's
Huns.
also important to note that the Franks actually maintained their control over their German strongholds. They just also expanded into the west, which the Franks being unusual in that fact.
No, that's just because the Franks had they were smart. They could just say, "Oh, we're running away," but in the meanwhile, they just maintained strength, so they could eat everything up later on, as we will see in a different episode.
So the Huns invaded Gaul, modern-day France, which was by this time mainly populated by Goths and Germanic tribes, such as the Franks and the Burgundians. And the
And
Huns
also,
proceeded to absorb a bunch of those Germanic tribes and Goths into their own forces, while the Western Romans were desperately trying to figure out what to do.
yeah, they tried to gather an empire under one of the more powerful generals of the time, at least general. He was essentially the de facto leader of the Western Roman Empire, Flavius Aetius, one of the either. He gathered an army to face the Huns, backed by a bunch of tribes that were more southward. I'm pretty sure they were he would have had support from Suebi tribes and Ostrogoths. I'm willing to say, or just different Visigoths.
Yeah, Aetius's army was bolstered primarily by Franks and Visigoths under the command of King Theodoric I.
Theodoric being another asshole that we'll get into later.
Being a important historical figure in his own right. And they met the Huns under Attila and their assorted puppet tribes at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains?
Catalonian Plains, yes.
Catalonian Plains, which is a very, very famous battle, obviously.
We'll probably want to do a episode more specific about this battle, and maybe some other Hunnic battles too, because they were very...
Suffice to say that the Battle of the Catalonian Plains is sufficiently important enough to merit its own video and discussion. So we will save those arguments about whether or not it was or was not important for its own video. But
what should be noted, though?
Suffice to say that the Roman army and their Frankish and Visigothic allies won the field, and the Huns withdrew from Gaul.
The only thing that I do think should be at least slightly noted is that this was achieved by the general the switch in Roman doctrine, in that they started using cavalry forces a lot more. They started switching to mobile cavalry forces supported by the German tribal infantry and a corps of strong infantry instead of the heavy infantry legions that they focused on before. Of course, the exact specifics.
The majority of that cavalry being Gothic mercenaries.
Of course.
Or Sarmatians, I suppose. And the majority of their infantry consisted of Frankish mercenaries.
The Romans were never good cavalrymen or fighters in general. But yeah.
Not in this time period.
No.
But
the quality had dropped.
The following year, Attila renewed his claims to his wife and empire, and invaded the Western Roman Empire again, this time charging into northern Italy by crossing the Alps, and he began sacking several major northern Italian cities, which would and displacing sufficient population that they actually wound up founding new cities, some of which continue to exist today. Vience probably being the most important of those.
Vience. Dude, I'm losing entirely of Vience. Sorry. How do you spell? Oh, Vicenza, I mean.
However you pronounce it. I'm American, damn it.
I was a little confused with the answer. What? No, Vicenza. Yeah, it's a city in the general Venetia region, which was one of the biggest siege cities during the time that Venice was more in its prime.
Yes.
So it will grow to be important later on.
Yes. Hoping to avoid the sack of Rome, the Western Roman Empire, Valentinian III, sent a series of envoys he sent 3 envoys to meet with Attila. These consisted of high-ranking officials and Pope Leo I. They met with Attila at Messino.
Yes, Mincio, I think. It's near Mantua, which is between Milan and Ravenna, which is the more known city in that region now. Ferrara. Basically, it's between the eastern Italian coastline and Milan.
Which currently consisted mostly of bare fields and burned down cities.
Yeah, and skulls. Lots of skulls. He liked skulls. That should be noted.
Yes, and they met with Attila and extracted a promise from Attila that he would withdraw from Italy. Prosper of Aquitaine gives the credit for that negotiation to Pope Leo I.
We also have, of course, Alaric. He was the leader of the he was the leader of the Ostrogothic tribes, I'm pretty sure. He led
I'm pretty sure he was Visigothic.
Or was he Visigoth? Yeah, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, Alaric, king of the Visigoths.
Yeah. He basically led an exodus of his people into the south to try and find a new home, which does happen to coincide with the Huns invading Italy. And they did their own fair share of sacking, including sacking Rome itself.
Yes, which, it should be noted, ended poorly for Alaric himself, but that may or may not have influenced Attila's decision, knowing that Alaric had died after sacking Rome.
Yeah.
And it's also worth noting that Italy was in the middle of a famine at the time, and Attila's invasion had basically left... There wasn't enough food in northern Italy to continue to maintain their attempt at invading.
There was no reason to actually consider it worthwhile at all anymore. From the entire prosperity had fallen because of a long period of significant cold that led to the main agricultural subsistence of the Roman Empire to not be feasible anymore for at least the period that it lasted for.
Especially not with all of the barbarians invading Gaul and Italy and Spain.
Yeah.
And also a long series of incompetent emperors mismanaging the shit out of it.
And of course, a bunch of faux emperors being ruled by generals and barbarians that called themselves Magistra Militum, but they were in essence just the emperor themselves.
Yes, so Attila ultimately decided to withdraw from Rome.
Yes.
And following this, the new Eastern Roman Empire, Marcian, halted tribute payments, and Attila decided to attack Constantinople. He did not achieve his attempt at attacking Constantinople, as he died of a brain hemorrhage on his wedding night. Following Attila's death, his sons Elek, Dinigziak, and Ernak all turned on each other and started trying to kill each other in order to take his throne for himself, and all of their subject tribes promptly rebelled.
Which led to the rise of the Gepids, which were the next big power, at least the next big power in the Dacia region, and successfully destroying the Huns' last attempt at unity at the Battle of Nedao in 454.
And the Huns promptly disappear from European records.
Yes, they're just gone. And they are then later on replaced by the Gepids in the general Pannonia Dacia region, the Kazakhs more to the north. You get the Bulgars later on, the Magyars. They all claim to be descendant from the Huns, though, which probably is true in some parts.
Given what we know about steppe culture reproduction habits, they probably are at least partially ethnically descended from the Huns.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much a brief history of the Huns. Anything else?
I'd say we could maybe slightly look at what was considered a government in the Huns. You can have a short talk about that, I think. Because you see, the Huns, they of course went through their migration, or the transformation from a bunch of loose tribes that basically raided as they wanted and sometimes amalgamated together for small incursions, into the great empire that Bleda and Attila together led, and in the end only Attila. But what was a government really there? Because you see, there was a point in the Hunnic Empire where an authority did exist, Attila. This authority was mainly controlled by using the Hunnic tribes as peacekeepers to maintain all the smaller Germanic, Gothic, and various other tribes as their subjects. This is very similar to the way the Arabs did it later on in their invasions, using Arab tribes, spreading them out over their conquered regions to basically mingle with the populations. This is also why the Huns kind of disappeared from history, because they basically were so spread out that they were bred out of existence, so to say.
Yeah, they were
And
absorbed into their subject peoples, in much the same way that the Mongol Empire dissolved, in the same way the Scythians went out, the same way the Parthians got absorbed into the Persians.
Indeed. That's just because, well, the tactic is very useful for a short-term application of control, because you have a very loyal tribe that you can put everywhere, and they will basically, while maintaining the governmental institutions inside the empire of the conquered peoples, you can just have them stand over it to say, give me money when you, every week or something, outside of your own system. But the issue is that ethnic change leads to long-term issues with the system, which nearly every government that used this way of control saw. I think it's a pretty important thing to note, at least, because it is one of the reasons why the Huns and nearly every single other large-scale Mongol, nomadic people found its end.
They were either absorbed into the people they conquered, or they were driven back to whatever steppe or desert region they came from.
Neat. Alright, I think we can call it an episode to that.
Yes, so thank you all for joining us on this episode, and apologies about the delay between this one and the last one. There were scheduling issues last week.
Indeed.
So I've been Zach. I've been joined here
This is
by
Nitty.
Joseph.
Right,
And
names.
we've been rambling about history. Thank you all, and good night.
Have a nice day, people.